Well, to start with, what's the simplest way to explain what is a very complex problem?
I think the simplest way is to turn that word and concept of complexity into an advantage. Complex systems like the Earth actually can be described in terms of just a few characteristics or properties that define their condition or state. And also, complex systems usually exist in well-defined states with transitions between them. So we can look at a simply defined Earth in one state being pushed over a threshold into another state. And the push, of course, is by us humans. So very simply, we can think of us pushing our home planet from one nice habitable state into something that's going to be a little bit more dangerous for us to exist in.
And a critical element there is that it's human, it's a problem that has arisen through human activity, but consequently is a problem that can be tackled through human activity.
Yes, that's correct. In fact, the current conditions or state that we've been in for the last 12,000 years are expected to last another 20 or 30,000 years without human pressure. But the fact is, we have already pushed the Earth out of those conditions. We call it the Holocene, or the geologists do, into what's now called the Anthropocene. So we humans have to deal with the fact that the Earth is moving away from our nice accommodating state. And we've got to steer it, guide it, or I should say steer ourselves, so that we can keep it in a habitable condition.
If the temperature of the Earth rises, what are the implications with each individual increase?
Well, right now we've pushed the Earth about a degree warmer than it's been through most of the Holocene. Already we see many changes. But one of the big risks we face is that there is probably a planetary threshold, a tipping point out there. We don't know where it is. It could be as low as 2 degrees, the Paris target, maybe even a bit higher. The risk that we face is once we push the Earth system over a potential threshold like that, internal feedbacks will take control and we'll go to a much hotter state, much less amenable for human well-being, but something that we cannot avoid if we cross that tipping point.
Is human activity absolutely essential to lower that temperature?
At the moment, I think it is, because I think what's happening now is we're sitting a bit over a degree above what we call pre-industrial, before humans really started burning massive amounts of fossil fuels. We are pretty much committed to 1.5. If that tipping element exists somewhere close to 2 degrees, we would be approaching it reasonably soon in the next few decades. So we've got to make sure we don't get that far, because if we get that far and decide, oops, this is too dangerous, we went across the tipping point, it's too late. We've got to make sure we avoid that risk.
A lot of debate by people who are reluctant to embrace the changes that need to occur is that why should Australia be active when they see in other countries a reluctance to embrace, and they point to places like China or India that are still burning a huge amount of fossil fuel. They say, why should we do anything when other countries aren't?
Well, climate change is a classic collective action problem that's really difficult to deal with when you've got a number of actors. And you have what a lot of people call the tragedy of the commons. Everyone points to everyone else and say, you are the problem. There are a number of lines of thought here. A really important one is that although China is burning a massive amount of fossil fuel now, historically it's been the wealthy countries of the West that have driven climate change. A second point is we probably have more capability to do something about it than the developing world that is still trying to bring people out of poverty. China's sort of in that middle position because it's moving very quickly away from just being a developing country into being a very rapidly emerging economy. So more and more people are saying, and indeed China itself is taking on more responsibility. But I think it's really important that those of us in wealthy countries, those of us that are historically been responsible for most of this problem, need to take a leadership role vis-a-vis the rest of the world in getting emissions down, getting climate change under control.
So the idea of a fair share, both a fair share from an individual perspective and from a national perspective, when we talk about making a fair share and contributing to the resolution of the problem, what are we talking about?
Well, the most immediate way we think of a fair share is in terms of emission reductions. In other words, in getting emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases down. One way we scientists use to determine how much and how fast that should happen is called a carbon budget. So it's like your household budget. How much more money do you have to spend the rest of the month or the rest of the year before you go into debt? Same thing with climate change and the carbon budget. We've got a certain amount of carbon we as a global community can burn before we get really close or beyond that 2-degree Paris target. The fair share issue comes in is how much of that budget should we get vis-a-vis how much should a Chinese person get, how much should an African person get. And there are debates about how to equitably share that. The simplest way is just a per capita one. Every human being has the same right, no more, no less than anyone else to the atmosphere. When you do that, we've got a really tight budget here in Australia.
That we've overspent?
We haven't quite overspent our budget yet for 2 degrees, but we spent an enormous amount of it. So when you look at any reasonable budget for 2 degrees, and you look at the rate at which Australia is spending that budget, we will blow it in the next decade. We will blow it even before our 2030 target. And that really emphasizes that we must really start turning our emissions down rapidly and deeply in the next couple of years if we want to be able to spread that budget out as we go down to, say, 2040 in a reasonable way. The sad thing is our emissions are actually going up. We're one of the few wealthy countries around the world where our emissions are still going up. So not only are we not even capping our emissions, they're going in the wrong direction.
For a lot of people, the scale of the problem immobilizes them. They think there's nothing I can do as an individual that's going to make a scintilla of difference. What's your message to people who don't know what their individual or community contribution could do?
Well, my message is, if you look at my hometown, Canberra, what we've done there. Okay, we're a small city, small part of the Australian population problem and so on. But about a decade ago, we decided to take action as a community in terms of becoming 100% renewable in just 1 decade, 10 years. And at first that looked huge. It was, a lot of people were very worried about it. Could we do that? Is it going to blow our territory budget? What are the implications of this? But as we got into it, as we started rolling out solar and wind, as the price came down, as we were generating employment in Canberra, the opinion turned very quickly that this is a good thing for Canberra to do. Now that we've actually achieved it, we have so much more momentum, so much more confidence of tackling transport, tackling waste, tackling stationary energy, built infrastructure. So I think my answer to the question is, it looks intractable, it looks huge. Once you start taking that first step, and then another step, getting together with your colleagues in your own community, suddenly you can see, yes, we can do this. So I think it's really important to get over that first blockage of, this looks so huge we can't do it. Take those first steps, look at other people in similar situations, look at Canberra, look at the ACT, and look at what we've achieved. It can be done.
In a previous conversation, I've heard you say that the social movement #MeToo is an interesting example of when a movement for change can reach a critical point where people are emboldened to speak their truth, which ripples through a much bigger community and encourages a lot more people. There's a kind of exponential growth in people's preparedness. Can I ask you to elaborate on why you think that the #MeToo movement does have a kind of resonance with what might have to happen with popular understanding of climate change?
Yeah, look, I think that exponential increase you say is really important, because we talked a little bit about tipping points and thresholds in the climate system. And of course, there are social tipping points and thresholds, and that's a good example of where there was a problem that was swept under the carpet for a long, long time, a very big problem, and there was just a trigger. Someone said, I'm fed up with this, and now with social media, I don't like this, I'm going to make it public. And then many other women came forward and said, now emboldened to say, yeah, me too, I've had this too. And it just took off. So I think we need a similar sort of thinking in the climate change area. And my proposal would be to simply say, a first really important step in this huge complex problem we could take is to say, no more fossil fuels. We know that by far the biggest contributor to the problem is burning fossil fuels. We know that there are all sorts of fossil fuel facilities already out there. They're hard to stop, they're hard to phase out. But we can say no new fossil fuels. No fracking, no more coal-fired power stations, no more oil drilling in the Arctic Sea, no more fossil fuels. And if that took off, if enough people rose up and told their politicians, you try to open up a new or support a new fossil fuel project, we're going to vote you out, that would really start turning turning the tide. So I think we need to look at those social movements, something very short, something easy to understand, a big problem that's actually interpretable in a way that people get and get quickly. We may have a chance to start turning this thing around. And I think, to me, the really critical thing is looking at that carbon budget. If you invest in new fossil fuels from today, you got virtually no chance of meeting that budget. The only way we got is to say no more and then phase out. That's what we have to do.
The political cycle, and by that I mean electoralism and governmental decision making, often seems incredibly short term compared to bigger problems, specifically climate change. Do you think that one of the key problems is that when politicians, Australian politicians, are confronted with issues of longer term decision making, they come back to ideas of jobs and growth because in their electoral cycle they feel that has more cut through with voters, and yet so we never get, so that the population never gets on a trajectory where longer term problems are seen as important?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think, again, the Canberra example shows how you might get around that because going into renewables has generated jobs for the territory. It's generated economic growth, and I would say social growth and understanding the problem, which is even more important in my view than economic growth. But in terms of the electoral cycle, it was a very nervous ACT government that said, yes, we'll try to do this. And there was a lot of angst about whether it could be achieved, whether it would blow budgets and so on. What happened, though, was once we got going in the project, people could see, actually it's working, it's not blowing out the budget. Support for the government grew. So the next electoral cycle, they had no problem in saying, we're going to push this through to conclusion. By the time they had the third election, which is just recently, they got an increased majority. So people understood, once we got going, that this delivery of long-term, you might call environmental goods, dealing with the climate change issue, is actually generating near-term local benefits. And so we got that apparent dichotomy aligned, which I think is probably important in our electoral system, that if it's only, well, something your children are going to say, we have to do this, and we have to have some pain now, you'll probably get thrown out. But if you say, if we're smart about this, we're going to get benefits now and benefits into the future, then you have a really good chance of pushing this forward.
There is one view that before that popular consciousness changes, serious dislocation needs to occur. Some people refer to the bombing of Pearl Harbor in the Second World War as the trigger that changed the perception of the American population that they needed to be part of the war effort. There's also a notion that there will be, I suppose, collateral damage, that the poor, people in vulnerable, low-lying communities, people in third world countries, they're not going to come through a process towards greater understanding without serious suffering. Do you subscribe to that?
No, I don't think so. I think in this case we can go forward without having that, although I think people are seeing around them what climate change actually means. Again, if I go back to the Canberra example, we had a disastrous bushfire in 2003. Killed a few people, wiped out 500 homes, cost a couple $1 billion worth of damage. And without a wind shift, it would have been really disastrous. It would have gone right through the city. I think that was a wake-up call that not doing something about climate change actually carries very big risks. We see it with the Great Barrier Reef, we see it in floods in Queensland, we see it in heat wave in Melbourne that killed 370 odd people in 2009. So it's coming home here to roost that if we don't do something, and this is only the beginning, there are really, really big risks, really, really big damages. So I don't know if it's quite a Pearl Harbor moment. It wasn't as dramatic as Pearl Harbor, but extreme weather events are short, they're sharp, they can kill people, they can cause enormous amounts of damage, and they definitely focus people's attention for a period of time. So one of the things we've done at the Climate Council is to make sure that people understand that what we're seeing now in Australia is not natural extreme weather events. They're events that normally happen, but they're on steroids now. They're being pumped up, they're becoming more intense, they're happening more often because we are pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So I think that in the back of people's mindsets coming through, when you now link that with the fact that renewable energy, for example, is becoming much cheaper, it's much cleaner, people can connect the dots and say, this makes sense. When you look at the Australian public more generally, we have the highest uptake of rooftop solar of any country in the world, by far. Now, obviously, we have a very good solar resource, but people see benefits. They see benefits for themselves in terms of more control over their energy supply, and particularly their energy costs. And they also, most of them also realize that they are doing their bit to try to get this climate change issue under control.
If we fail to keep emissions within the 2 degrees Celsius target, what does that mean for commercial agriculture in Australia?
Look, I think already commercial agriculture is under pressure at 1 degree. 2 degrees is going to be more than double worse. It's going to be 3 or 4-fold worse. The thing that immediately hits you is a lot of our broadacre farming occurs in the southwest of WA and in a big area in the southeast of the country. And those areas rely on reasonably reliable winter rainfall. That is already disappearing. If you look at WA, say middle of the 20th century, 8 or 9 years out of every 10, they got a rainfall they needed in the period they needed. That's dropped off to only 2 or 3 years out of 10 now. So the reliable rainfall coming off the Southern Ocean, those fronts have slipped southwards because of the expanding tropics, what we call the Hadley cell in the climate science business. And that is definitely already affecting Australian agriculture. During the Millennium Drought, our ability to export food, which is important for the global food system, dropped way off. We lost, I think, 0.5% of GDP, so it actually affected our GDP output because production went down so much through that drought. That drought had this climate change signal, and that was telling us that as the climate warms, those fronts are pulling southwards, away from the Australian continent. It's going to continue to get even drier in the southwest and the southeast. Droughts will become more intense, and they're probably going to last longer. So already that's telling us if we don't adapt, our agricultural production will continue to go down. So it's not a case of what happens when we hit 2. If we let it hit 2, we're going to be in strife because already we're feeling the effects at 1.
So at the moment, there are authors in Australia like Charles Massey, who is promoting the idea of regenerative farming and also natural systems farming, I think that's the term, where they look at the nature of a natural system and try to enhance it. Do you think that climate change will necessitate a rethink of the way we farm and the type of animal husbandry that we conduct in Australia?
Yeah, I will. Charlie Massey's idea is really good in that we've used a very simplistic European-style agriculture, which is basically bashed the bush for a long time and created a lot of problems, whether it's erosion and weed infestation and feral animals, all sorts of things. So he's on the right track that we have to really understand how our systems work and mimic them. On top of that, though, you've got a rapidly changing climate. So even without human pressures, that's going to change ecosystems anyway. So the norm at which you're trying to mimic is changing under your feet. And you have to take that into account too, is that the ecosystems which are going to be on the Australian continent by mid-century are not the ones we knew last century, even without human pressures on them, because of the rapidly changing climate. And that needs to be taken into account as we try to rejig our farming systems to be more in sync with the natural cycles and so on.
You've spoken very positively about the Canberran experience of both voter enthusiasm and political efficacy. Do you think that at heart you are optimistic about the prospects for dealing with our emissions and bringing the Anthropocene to a more manageable climate regime, or do you have deep-seated negative views?
Well, the way I often put it is it depends on how much coffee I've had in the morning. If I've had enough of my lone blacks, I'm probably a bit more optimistic. But no, realistically, you have to actually say that Canberra is a special example in that we're a small city, a bit under 500,000 people. We do not have any fossil fuel industries to deal with. We are small enough that we can put our 100% renewables into the southeastern Australian grid, and it doesn't have a huge impact on the operation of the grid itself. So we had a lot of things in our favor when we did this. Still, it's a great achievement. So I think a real reality check is to say, if you really want to transform Australia, you're going to butt up really quickly with very powerful vested interests, which we already hit with the fossil fuel industry and so on, their influence in the political system and so on. So I think we've got a real challenge ahead. We haven't reached that social tipping point yet that's going to push us toward a renewable future. We've got to do that in the next few years. That's critical. So I say if we really haven't, as a nation, got a clear plan to deliver far deeper emissions by 2030 than we're proposing to do now, if we don't have that at least plan agreed and in place by 2020, I think the odds are looking pretty bad for us doing our fair share on the climate issue.
As we speak, the idea of fake news gains increasing currency, and obviously the election of Donald Trump as the US president and his unrelenting attacks on established media, especially those that disagree with him obviously, has created this notion that people doubt the authenticity of information that they don't already agree with, that people are reluctant to take on new ideas. Is that characteristic of contemporary social discussion and journalism working specifically against any resolution of climate change?
I think it is, but I think it actually predates Trump and the fake news. I mean, I've been in this game for a long time, and we've seen climate deniers, skeptics, whatever you want to call them. We've seen people pumping out fake scientific papers or really dodgy scientific papers that look like they're authentic and they're not. That's happened for well over a decade. So perhaps you could say even the climate change issue has maybe spawned some of the ideas that are used in the fake news movement. And when you look underneath it, there have been some powerful fossil fuel related interests that fund a lot of this stuff. So we've been having to deal with this for a long time. So the more recent Trump-driven fake news is I think, an example of what we were already hitting, spreading out into many other aspects of life. And it certainly, from our experience, it does make it difficult to communicate really reliable, authentic, genuine science compared to all the stuff that's out there. So if anything, it's probably gotten a bit worse with the spread of the fake news movement, although the latest polls I've seen say that the skepticism, the denialism of climate in Australia peaked about 5 to 10 years ago. And there's much more acceptance of the genuine science today than there was 5 or 10 years ago.
How should ordinary Australians understand the risk? How would you characterise the risk that they face as individuals and as citizens of this country?
I think what you have to do is bring this very complicated issue down to something that matters for people and what they value in their lives. So you bring it down to health issues. Health issues are really important. And when you see people dying in heat waves, when you see people dying in bushfires, there's this idea that, well, you shouldn't come out, when these tragedies occur because, it's a bad look to go ambulance chasing and this sort of thing. But I think we've been very effective within the Climate Council of saying these risks are going up. Extreme weather events are getting worse. These are the things that hurt you, your family, the neighborhoods, the ecosystems, the coral reefs, the things that you value. And there is absolutely no doubt now about the science, and people are getting that. So I think you've got to relate this big complex problem to things that people experience now, and things that are risks to people that they understand. And I think that really is an effective way, because that is a genuine way. Climate change isn't going to be some totally different new thing coming in. We have a climate system, and it is variable, but it's changing in ways that are really increasing risk for people and so on. And you can make that connection, and I think that's a very effective way to communicate the reality of the science in a way that people get.
Well, it's interesting for me that two areas of human activity, namely military strategic thinking and commercial planning, seem to have a much stronger fix on the risk, on the consequences of those risks, than people within political debate do. It's as if the military and commerce are clearer about what they're facing and don't have to go into the ideological debate. Yeah. Could I get you to elaborate on that?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good point, and I would say the military are well ahead of the commercial side in doing that. The commercial side always has a vested interest in some way or another, looking for an angle for how they might either survive this as a company or an enterprise or even benefit from it. The security community and the defense community have a really hard-headed view of this, because their job is to look at the security of a nation or security of a group of people or a group of nations, whether it's NATO or whatever. And so they got to look at all risks, no matter what their ideological bent is. Terrorism is obviously a big risk. But a lot of the military people are saying by far the biggest long-term risk is climate change, much bigger than terrorism. And they look at it in a really interesting way. They say because extreme weather events are changing, because precipitation patterns are changing, because temperatures changing, we have built our societies and our infrastructure around recognizable and dependable patterns of how the climate operates. When that shifts, you put stress on people. you put stress on the most vulnerable people. They can't grow enough food. They're hit with floods that they can't deal with. Countries like Bangladesh, Syria, African countries, you immediately have a security risk. Because when people can't grow enough food, when they're getting flooded, when they're getting hammered by storms, and they don't have the infrastructure we have, they don't have the insurance we have, they've got to do one of two things. They've got to migrate, they have to get out of that area, or they have to fight to get resources. Those are huge security risks as people start moving around the world in bigger numbers into new areas, into Europe, towards Australia, and so on. So the security community really gets this, and they are extremely scared about the way we're going because we are not yet getting climate change under control. Governments around the world are not yet doing enough to meet the Paris targets, and the security people know the implications of going to a 3-degree world, and they know the implications of going to a 4-degree world. Many of them will tell you they don't think a 4-degree world will support anywhere near the number of people we have today. And that's a really scary scenario.